Yes, well, it seems to me once again that the whole issue of the morality of our nation, as supposed to be expressed through the supremacy of God, which is the beginning of the Constitution that we talk about, has been demeaned, has been lost.
I am a husband, a father, a lawyer, a Christian, and a proud Canadian. I started this series because it was clear that our nation needs truth. Not just another biased narrative, but real information of substance. We need access to facts and the freedom to think for ourselves. I'm Leighton Grey, and this is Grey Matter.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Grey Matter. Well, I'm just pleased as punch today. We have a real treat for you. Someone whom I've described and I would say is a national treasure. Imagine, if you will, someone who's about as old as Joe Biden and maybe slightly older, but is the exact opposite in terms of corpus mentis, a man with a prodigious memory, a distinguished career in Canadian politics, one of actually the last living signatory to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, someone who was intimately and directly involved in the crafting of the Charter, and in particular, the vaunted, much maligned now Section 1 of the Charter, and a former premier. And to top it all off, in his I would say in his new prime of life, his second or third career, he's a freedom fighter, and his name is the Honourable Mr. Brian Peckford. Thanks so much for being with us again today, Brian.
Thank you, Leighton, for inviting me. I appreciate coming on your program.
Yeah. So as we always do, we're going to start with some framing aphorisms. I know that in the past, Brian has been good enough to appear on this program twice before, and he's been somewhat delighted by these. Hopefully we don't disappoint him today. The first one is from a poet that Mr. Peckford and I both admire very much. Although he's been dead a very long time, everything that he seemed to write about, especially in something called Areopagitica, is very, very relevant today. And his name is John Milton, who probably wrote the most important things about Jesus Christ and the Bible outside of the Bible. Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained, if you're interested. Anyway, he said this, he wrote this: "Give me the liberty to know, to utter, and to argue freely according to conscience above all liberties," a concept that is quite alien to our Canadian government today in Ottawa. Secondly, from William Penn, from roughly the same era, 1668, who wrote, "Those who will not be governed by God will be ruled by tyrants." Next, from a 20th century economist and journalist, but very much before his time, H.L. Mencken, who wrote, "The whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed," sound familiar?
Sure.
"And hence clamorous to be led to safety by menacing it with an endless series of hobgoblins, all of them imaginary." Folks, in this context, the President Biden, who I just mentioned earlier, he's threatening to call a climate emergency. And the last one is from another author. Sadly, he passed away some years ago, but someone who Brian and I both admire very much, the late Dr. Roger Scruton, who wrote, "Whatever our religion and our private convictions, we are the collective inheritors of things both excellent and rare." And if there's a better description of conservatism, I haven't read it. Brian, back to you. So for those of you who are not familiar with Brian, and you ought to be, Brian has appeared twice on this program. And what we're going to do in those previous interviews, you went into quite a bit of detail about Brian's background. And I would encourage you, if you would, to go back and read and listen to or watch those interviews, because I think that's very important to understand our guest and his worldview and where he comes from. But today, what we want to focus on are some of the things that Brian is commenting on right now, because he's not just a retired politician who's walked off into the sun. In the context of COVID-19, he's come to the fore and he's re-entered, the fray as it were, and writes one of the best blogs anywhere. And he takes on a lot of these really challenging issues that we're facing in Canada right now, particularly in the context of the tension between individual rights and freedoms and the overreach of government. And so in that context, Brian, where I'd like to start is you've written a lot about how the whole concept of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, as you understood it, being one of the participants, one of the drafters of it, has really been, in many ways, has been subverted and really perverted in the way that it's being interpreted and applied by the courts of our country and by governments in this country. So could you start there and just give people sort of an overview of your understanding of what the charter was intended to be and why it seems to be letting us down?
Well, thanks very much, Leighton, for that introduction and explanation. Yeah, I got really concerned back when I really should have been concerned before, because some of the early decisions of the courts as it relates to the Constitution Act 1982 were ones which many of us should have highlighted at the time, like 40 years ago. I did get involved back in the 90s when a number of professors wrote articles about how the Constitution Act came together and pointed out the error of their ways, trying to indicate that this was a sort of a plot organized by the Prime Minister Trudeau Sr. and some of his mandarins, and that us premiers had very little to do with it. And so my concern with the Constitution development and the Constitution Act 1982 really stems back to those early days. And even when we were negotiating it, people may forget that it was the Prime Minister at the time when we were trying to negotiate patriation, which meant we bring the Constitution back to Canada and add to it the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that he actually left the table and sabotaged.
This is a story that's seldom told, isn't it? Yeah, this is a great story.
It's never told. and when I do tell it, many people, even in the audiences, try to gloss over it in their questions afterwards, or don't even ask a question about it. And they had never heard of it before. Because the way we were approaching the Constitution was as full participants in the 1867 Constitution Act, which had certain powers with the provinces and certain powers with the federal government. And as we began to negotiate with the Prime Minister at the time, he was beginning to leverage that we were really just like municipalities and not provinces under the Constitution. And therefore, what the federal government would say at the end of the day would be what would go. When we began to remind him of the Constitution under which we were then operating, and he really couldn't do this, he got very upset to the point of leaving the table.
Seems to be a genetic problem.
It seems to be a genetic problem. How true? Yeah, no question. So the whole point was not only did we have to forge something that protected the powers of the provinces as well as the government of Canada, but also put that clearly in any new document we were going to produce.
Right.
And to that end, when we got involved, not only with bringing the Constitution home and an amending formula, because there was no point of bringing the Constitution home if we had no way to change it. It wouldn't work. And 10 times had been tried since the 1920s to the 1980s to do this, and it always failed, primarily over the whole question of an amending formula. How are we going to change it in the future if we have to change it ourselves? Oh my gosh, I suddenly got something great in my hands. We can actually change our own Constitution. Well, now, how do we do that? And so there were many elements to this process of 1981-82, 17 months, by the way, of talks between the provinces and the federal government to patriate and have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But a core part of that, as we move through the system, and as at the time Many commentators were talking about the charter, and that it was really just the prime minister who really wanted a charter, when that was not at all true. What we wanted was a charter that would work, and an amending form that would work, and a charter that protected provincial rights as well as individual rights. And as we got more and more into it, the premiers were very, very insistent, not only on the provincial power part of it, but also the individual right parts. And this has really gotten lost and never written about all that much. And so when it came down to, for example, as you referred to, Section 1 of the Charter, which has been greatly maligned in my view, there was a great argument that we had in there at the time, the word justify, before you could suspend any individual rights that were going to come later in the Charter. We argued over, and myself and Peter Lougheed, Sterling Lyon of Manitoba, Bill Bennett of British Columbia in particular, and Angus MacLean of PEI, we argued we needed to strengthen that. Justify sounds great, it's a great word. And that's how demonstrably justify got put in there, is because we insisted upon it, because we were getting really, really concerned that if we really were going to do something about freedom of speech, freedom of press, assembly, all the major freedoms and rights, then we should make sure that any breach of these, or any chance of governments being able to temporarily suspend them for emergency purposes, that they must at the same time demonstrably demonstrate this.
So you actually foresaw that something like that happening at the time, Brian? That was
exactly.
Oh, interesting.
And primarily because we were concerned about the way that the federal government had gone about this process in the beginning, leaving the table.
Right.
And we took the federal government to court. And at the end of the day, the federal government, because of opposition from us and others, decided to do a reference to the Supreme Court. And so all of the cases got combined together.
That's another story that's not told very often, is it? About that court challenge.
Exactly.
That's lost in the mists of history, unfortunately.
September, right?
Yeah.
September 1981, and where the court ruled that what the prime minister was trying to do, and leaving the table and doing his own patriation and his own charter, was unconstitutional. And therefore, he was forced back to the table. The premiers weren't forced back to the table. We were already at the table. It was he who left. But to come back to your main point that you were making, because I get very excited about this business of that particular court case, and how it's not been interpreted historically properly, but also not being interpreted properly is the province's concern with individual rights, and why we wanted to insist upon strengthening justify, so that it was demonstrably justified. Many lawyers today and many courts today ignore demonstrably justify and talk about reasonable, about the word reason in Section 1. But it's within the reasonable framework one must consider that you still must demonstrably justify what you're doing before you satisfy the terms of that Section 1.
Right.
And so it was the provinces who insisted upon this business of ensuring that these rights and freedoms that we were about to enunciate and that we were negotiating were actually going to be there when crucial times came in our history, like during the truckers' convoy. So, and once again, many people don't historically even recognize the big role that people like Angus MacLean of PEI, the farmer, the blueberry farmer of PEI, former Veterans Affairs Minister for John Diefenbaker, and a veteran himself. I knew Mr. MacLean and his wife very, very well. And what a strong person for Canada and for the Charter. And of course, Sterling Lyon of Manitoba, who's hardly ever mentioned, very, very strong, as was Peter Lougheed and Bill Bennett and Angus and Alan Blakeney of Saskatchewan.
Mm-hmm.
These were really the strong first ministers who strongly supported this demonstrably justify part of Section 1. And we just thought at the time then that it was quite... and then, of course, the other part that people ignore, some lawyers and many so-called legal experts call it the preamble. I don't call it the preamble. We did not call it the preamble. It's the first part of the charter.
In the
charter. It's not something that comes before the charter, because when you say preamble, usually something that comes before, and it could easily be interpreted that was outside the...
It's the courts that really gave it that name, isn't it? And that's part of the problem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I remember the debates about that, as well as about justice. I remember them extremely well. And we were all, Levesque included at the time, there was not one first minister who debated or questioned about putting in the supremacy of God.
Mm-hmm.
Not one.
No.
Of course, as we were all Christians at the time, so it was self-evident to us that the God that we were talking about was a Judeo-Christian God, because we knew no other.
Right.
Could it be any other God if we knew no other? I mean, come on. So that was extremely important to begin the charter. Mercy of God, rule of law, demonstrably justified.
Mm-hmm.
And as we got into this thing, Leighton, during the truckers' convoy, and some of us started to speak out and take actions like you have done for different people and organizations on the charter, these conversations haunted me because they came back. They came back to me in spades.
Mm-hmm.
As we did, like some of the historical accounts of the process of the Constitution, where people said, you left Levesque out. You left Quebec out. Well, just so happened that night we put it together, he wasn't there. We looked for him. He wasn't in his room. Neither was the Quebec delegation. They were across the river in Hull having a late supper, the delegation. But nobody knew where they were. Nobody knew they were in Hull because all of them were gone. My minister at the time was since passed away, Gerald Anheimer, actually went to their suite door, knocked on the door, trying to find them. So, but by the same token, the next morning, when we finalized that proposal to go to all the first ministers, Levesque was there, and the Quebec delegation, and they had an opportunity to look at what we had put together overnight. And as Premier Lougheed and others have related in telling the story about that time. So in the same way as the issue of Levesque haunts me because I know the difference.
Yeah.
So does this business of the supremacy of God and the demonstrably justified. So I think those two examples demonstrate the importance that the premiers put on the charter. And Brian, it wasn't just on the provincial power part of the Constitution.
Can I ask you a couple of questions about the spirit of those meetings at that time? And two things in particular I'm curious about. Number one, was there a concern around the table with the first ministers, let's say excluding Trudeau, that the charter could be used as a means of expanding or creating rights? I'm talking about the judiciary now, in the way that we've begun to see this, or we have seen this unfold over the past 40 years. That's number one. And secondly, we now live in a country where we haven't had a First Ministers' Conference in 8 years. And we have a Prime Minister who says, I think he said recently, that if the premiers didn't do what he said, he would just go around them for the benefit of Canadians. This is really frightening. Yes. It's a frightening, really complete misunderstanding of what Canada is constitutionally. But my
Yes.
question is, was government overreach, federal government overreach, as much of a problem back then? So it's kind of a two-parter. Were you concerned about what the judiciary would do with the charter? And secondly, was federal government overreach, in other words, the federal government behaving like a national government, which it's not, was that something that was of concern around the table when you were going through these meetings?
I'm glad you asked it. Very few people ask the questions you ask, which is very complimentary of you, but very sad about.
Well, it's because I want to know.
A lot of the, well, exactly. I wish more would want to know. Look, very early on, Sterling Lyon, René Lévesque, Peter Lougheed, myself, and some of the delegation in British Columbia were extremely concerned. And when Trudeau left the table halfway through the negotiations, they said, "We told you so." Because even myself at the time did not believe that he would leave the table, that he would argue, fight hard through Chrétien and through some of these other mandarins. They would, be putting forward things that we're going to have to negotiate out, but never to the point of leaving the table. Now, Lévesque had said that.
Mr. Lévesque gets a lot of the blame, though. It gets shunted off onto him, but actually you're saying it was actually Mr. Trudeau who is the problem at the table.
Absolutely. That wasn't Mr. Lévesque at all.
Fascinating.
Until near the end there. But remember, he had two very strong ministers, Lévesque did. Claude Morin was one, and Jacques Parizeau was the other. They were there. Very strong personalities, highly cultured, learned individuals, not only in the broader sense, but in the narrower sense of Quebec's place in Canada, and all of the jurisprudence that goes with that. Very, very qualified, interesting individuals, as was Lévesque himself. So yes, there was a real concern about federal overreach because we began to see it. And then when Trudeau left the table, we saw it. That's why these demonstrably justify and supremacy of God things became so important at the end of the day.
Right.
Because of that. But to take it one step further, to perhaps help people understand, even at the last few days, various delegations were bringing up what you just mentioned, that later the judicial overreach.
Right.
And in almost every case, except Lévesque, there were, what shall I call them, advisors, not only provincial bureaucrats, but advisors that we had brought in to assist us in negotiating, who reassured us that this wouldn't happen. And at the end of the day, any further concerns about that were sort of put one side. No, you're overreacting. You're being too, right? And the desire to not fail, right? Overrode any additional concerns. And I think having achieved what we did achieve and forced Trudeau back to the table, perhaps also weakened our resolve, even though it was raised, right? In the last few days, it was definitely raised. And a lot of us still had concerns. I did in particular. Sterling Lyon was by far the star in this argument of federal overreach and later judicial activism and so on. Sterling Lyon was the star in that, and he does not get enough credit on that score. But Lévesque's people were too, of course. They would be right on top of that, right? And were all through the piece. And at one point, when the Gang of Eight were together after Trudeau had left the table and then we were going to fight him in the courts, we had our own meetings
Wow.
And one of the meetings was in a hotel in Montreal. I don't know if I've recorded this or I mentioned it on your program. One of the last two times, I'm not sure. And I got to write it down somewhere because I've got it in my note somewhere. Lougheed and Levesque almost came to blows.
Really? I bet it wasn't over a golf game.
No.
Are you at liberty to say why they got upset with each other? Or is it violating a confidence?
Well, I can't get in too much into that, but simply to say that what happens in all these kinds of circumstances, as I know you appreciate in dealing with clients and other lawyers, after a while, if you hammer it so much, that's like me now, in hammering, after a while, people turn off.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? They turn off.
Yeah.
And I think on the couple of points that Levesque was making, and almost implying that some of us who are on the federal side on these, that's when lies will go, oh, just 1 second now. Just 1 second, Reddy. You are implying, I got to tell you. And the football player came out.
Well, he had just been through the national energy policy, so
and
in fairness.
Course, exactly, and so much more. Well, no question. So, oh yeah, there was no question, and there was stuff written, and I think a lot of that has been destroyed. For example, what has been destroyed also is those proposals in my book of 2012. I still have them here in the file. Copies of my proposals like that I put on the table in the night, right, of November 4th, and then presented the next day to the premiers, and then later I presented on behalf of the premiers to the full conference, which led only a few hours later to a deal. It was based on those proposals.
Right.
I went looking for them when I was writing my book, and I had to search. Of course, I had to go to the archives in the Government of Canada. Nowhere to be found. Those proposals are nowhere to be found.
Incredible. But they are retained in your book.
Yes.
Yeah.
I copied them all and had them put in my book.
That's a blessing. That's a blessing. It's, and
Brian, I still have them here.
It is hard for contemporary Canadians to imagine a group of premiers like yourselves, like the Group of Eight, who were prepared not only to stand up to a prime minister and tell him to get in his lane, as it were, but more than that, who were willing to sit down and do really hard work and try to build something as important as the Constitution, as important as the Charter. That spirit of cooperation, that spirit of pushback in terms of being first ministers, not being people that, a prime minister could just go around. That's been lost in our country politically. Do you have an explanation as to why we don't have more premiers? And I don't want to sort of color them all with the same brush, but, there are a group of premiers in this country who really are yes men for Trudeau. And that wasn't true of your time. What do you think has changed in the political landscape in Canada that would explain that?
I have spent a lot of time thinking about that. I've tried to write about it on occasion. Sometimes I have in a paragraph or two, and I have real difficulty coming to grips with it. Very often, when you're in power, you have some sort of power. In my case, as a provincial premier in a small province, but still the power situation is there. And you're looking around for people to be strong people, both to be ministers, but also to be deputy ministers, and people. And you see this person who is unbelievably competent as a director of finance of a given department and has helped produce cabinet papers, and you ask who are the authors of these papers and so on. And then you might have had an opportunity to see this person in action in various meetings you would have with this ministry and that ministry, right? And the ministers and deputy ministers would bring in some of their other key people that helped them formulate this cabinet paper and so on. Well, you know what? That person who was unbelievable ADM became a disastrous DM. They didn't grow in leadership.
Mm.
They didn't grow in leadership. They couldn't think outside their own narrow, particular field. Even though watching them in action, I could have swore, I could have bet my house on that this person would work out, only to find out later they didn't. There were others who did grow into the job, but they were in the minority. They were in the minority. And the same way with the ministers. They were in the minority. And so this issue of leadership, I did a speech on it once over in Vancouver. I think I still have it somewhere. And I actually went back to Alexander.
Yeah.
I actually went to Alexander.
We're talking Alexander the Great, or who conquered the world by the age of 30. Yeah, okay. Yeah.
I went back to Alexander the Great. And an incident which is recorded in the book, which I still have here in my library, here, my very small library now. But I kept certain books and one of them was Alexander's, right? About Alexander, where he was confronted with this incident whereby one of the major power, I think it might have been the King of Persia or whatever, he was making big inroads militarily and so on. By the way, he always kept books with him when he went on all his campaigns. And he had a library with him. He had a whole bunch of people who know nothing about military stuff, but were just thinkers.
Sure. Yeah.
Alexander did. Of course, he had Aristotle.
Yes.
Around as well as one of his teachers.
Yeah.
But he didn't have, there was a very important part of his entourage as he went and on these military excursions. But in one real key incident where he was given an unbelievable offer, including the daughter of the king or whatever, and a whole bunch of land and a whole bunch of that. And his general came to him and said to him, if I was Alexander, right? If I was Alexander, I would accept this proposal. He said, and if I were you, we would not be here today, or whatever. That's a wonderful quote. I'll find it and send it to you. But it's much better than what I just said now. In other words, I'm not you, you're not me. Here's what I have to do. He went on and rejected the proposal and defeated the enemy, which he in general thought he wasn't going to be able to do, and did many, many more things. But he showed leadership. He showed maturity, that he knew who he was. He knew what he believed in, and he knew how he was going to accomplish it. Yeah. What's happened in today's world through our educational system, it seems to me, like I've got professors that I remember, right? Others that I quite quickly forgot. But I still have a number, 2 or 3 professors and 1 teacher. There were leaders. They were unbelievable leaders in their field. You don't see that much anymore. And we're not cultivating excellence, nor are we using the word or cultivating the word leadership. In my day, I had my dad, I had my grandfather on both sides of my family. And I had a great high school final year of school. Finally, there was a teacher. And luckily, I went to university and discovered 2 or 3 really first-class scholars and people who were, people of the world, and who they themselves grew into their jobs and would give you great examples and great things to read, right? So I think it's a question of the lack of reverence towards the concept of leadership.
You're talking about a servant leadership, where a person understands that their role is they have a duty to the people that they're serving, as opposed
Exactly.
to this sort of entitlement that elected people seem to presume
E-
today, simply
Exactly.
because they got more votes than the next person. So,
Yeah.
Brian, I want to sort of segue into that, and I want to get to a couple of things you've written on your blog recently. But before we go there, there's one final sort of general question about what's happening in the Canadian polity right now. As you know, the federal Liberals are sinking like a stone to the bottom of the ocean in the polls. And it looks like, by all accounts, it's very likely that Mr. Poilievre is going to be our next prime minister at some point. But do you think that the problems that we're experiencing in Canada right now, most of which have been created by the Trudeau Liberals, in my respectful view, can be solved through a change at the ballot box, or do you think one of the antidotes to what we have right now, and perhaps a more effective one, would be a group of strong leaders in their respective provinces working together as a coalition to fight against this federal government overreach? Which one do you think would be more effective in terms of trying to restore some sense of reason and justice and really purpose to the Canadian political scene? Because if you look at what people are saying now, the confidence in our political leaders, the confidence in our institutions across the board, in our educational system, it's just been almost completely lost by most people. And no one seems to believe that some people are saying that Canada is broken. But do you think that a federal election it could potentially fix that? Or do you think more needs to be done, something along the lines of what I described, for example, with premiers working together?
I thought up to a few years ago that it would be possible to do it through the federal, if you will, system and new parties. But my experience has has led me in a different direction.
Right.
And so I don't think a change, as important and as necessary as it is to rid ourselves of where the Liberal Party has descended, that there is the strength, and again come back to the whole business of duty to serve, of leadership, of leadership to restore the country's integrity.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that's missing, and then you might have seen that in my blogs over time, is the whole question of honesty and integrity.
Yes. Yes.
And I just saw it again in the last few days, right in the last few weeks, as it related to the leader of the BC Conservative Party here in BC,
Yes.
of which I was a member
Yes.
long before his conversion.
Yeah.
And what he has done, appointing candidates and so on, the same undemocratic system that I thought he was in favor of getting rid of.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And his dishonesty towards me, for example, as an individual, as a person who's lived here in BC since '93. So I've come to the view that some other means must be found to restore our confederation, our federal system, our country, Canada. And that, of the two that you posed, there's no question that if there was 5 or 6 strong premiers today advocating a national vision for Canada, that it would be more effective than changing the political parties in Ottawa.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I agree totally. Now, I want to talk about a couple of things you've written about recently on your blog. One of them was you commented on recent convictions that occurred in Alberta over the Coots affair.
Yes.
And you said, our legal system may find me or us guilty, but the legality and morality of our country are no longer aligned. Now, that was actually a quotation from Marco von Hugenboss.
Yes.
But you picked up on that, and you wrote a very interesting blog piece about that case, expressing your concern about it in the context of the Canadian legal system. You want to explain kind of the crux of what you were concerned about there?
Yes, well, it seems to me once again that the whole issue of the morality of our nation, as supposed to be expressed as the supremacy of God, which is the beginning of the Constitution that we talked about, has been demeaned, has been lost. And once you start to look at a national entity, right, in terms of divorcing yourself from integrity and honesty and morality, then you are in trouble as a country. The way these people were treated too, right? The Coots people, the way they have been treated, is not part of the national jurisprudence of our country, right? There's once again, no morality or fairness in the system. I always, years ago, used the word fair. And I remember years ago as a boy when we were selecting teams on a makeshift rink or a makeshift soccer field, and suddenly one dominant person was trying to stack the one team against the team that I was going to be on, and you could see it clearly there. And I remember having fights with this person, and my word was, I go home and say to my dad, but it wasn't fair. And so this seems to me that in moving away as we have, both in our school system, universities, and so on, through the fabric of our nation, moving away from, for example, nobody's concerned about, I mean, I've written all the premiers, like Mr. Polyev and others, and Mr. Singh, and all the leaders in the federal parliament said, why will you not amend the conflict of interest legislation and close the loophole whereby a federal MP cannot serve if he's violated the Canadian law, as determined by the Ethics or Conflict of Interest Commissioner or a court of law? Mm-hmm. Why won't you close that? Now, this tells you everything you want to know. This tells you all you want to know. And guess what the Conservatives did, and why I dismissed them as being capable of restoring Canada's excellence and morality and integrity. Guess what the Conservatives tried to do? Because I guess somewhere in their flank there were a few people who I was advocating. I think there were a couple of district associations across the country, ridings, who were sort of agitating for this, what I was talking about. And what did they do? They brought in something which later the Polyev said, I'm not bound by what the convention agreed to. I'm not bound by that. But the convention said they can break the law 3 times before we'll take real serious action. This is their way of dealing with this. So once you get going down that road, right, and then the parties will not publish audited financial statements on their websites. None of them have. I've been insisting upon that. None of that. I wrote all the premiers for, and one of the reasons why the leadership is lacking, and I don't know if we got the strong premiers to pursue your idea, which I think is an excellent one, much better than the other one for sure. Mm-hmm. And asking them to take a look at what you're doing. Yeah. And do a reference to the Supreme Court, to your own Supreme Court, to see whether what you are doing in the mandates and lockdowns is really constitutional or not.
Right.
And none of them, most of them never even answered me. Mm-hmm. And one that answered me was my own problems of which I was premier and threatened to take me to court.
Oh, incredible. You know, I think it was you explained to me that this custom of referring to members as honorable or right honorable used to be very, very meaningful in terms of, in fact, I think you explained to me that not so long ago, that if a member of parliament, especially some high-ranking minister or a prime minister, were even accused of impropriety, that they would take a leave of absence from the House or the legislature.
Yes.
During which time the matter would be investigated, and before they could return to the House, yes, or the legislature, they would have to be cleared of any wrongdoing. That seems to be a very sensible custom that we have completely lost. We have a prime minister right now who's been convicted 6 times of ethics complaints, and that's only scratching the surface of what we
And
know
that's
he's done.
and that was
I
in
mean,
the act. That
he could
wasn't
have been
just an ethics
convicted
code.
60
That was
times,
part of the
60
law.
times already. I mean, it's so bad, Brian, that we have a member of the House who's trying to convince the speaker that the opposition cannot accuse the prime minister of being corrupt. They can't use that word anymore.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
wow, how did we get here? This is
How
so
do we
awful.
get there? Yeah,
Whoa.
exactly. And so it's obvious now, I think, that we're going to need a far greater push by the leadership of the country, both business and labor and civic leaders and the universities and the premiers, perhaps led by the premiers, to try to bring about this change, right?
Yeah.
Because if it does not happen, then our country will become an extremely sad place to live. Many of my friends have actually left the country.
Yeah.
Have not only left BC because of their taxation and regulation policies, but have actually left the country and gone to Florida, gone to have a young family here that's permanently gone to Panama with 6 kids, all under 11.
Wow.
And are doing fine, thank you very much. In Panama. They've gone to Panama with other people like mine. And other people gone to Costa Rica, people gone to Mexico, and on it goes. I mean, I don't know how many people I met down in Mexico last year when I went down to the Baja Peninsula from Canada, who were in the process of moving to small communities in the southern Baja province of Mexico. It's just amazing. So, yeah. And to get back to honorable again, and once honorable was only relegated to those who were in the Privy Council of Canada.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Federal minister automatically becomes a member of Privy Council, as does, of course, the Prime Minister. Okay. And others who were chosen. That's how I got to be honorable, was because of the patriation. Those first ministers who were involved in it. We were, and we're one of the few, however many of us are left, from that group who were then sworn into the Privy Council by Her Majesty the Queen. How many even legitimate Privy Councillors are there that were sworn in by Her Majesty the Queen or the monarch? Very, very few. By the way, the old sword was used as well.
Interesting. Well, Brian, I wanted to ask you about a letter you recently wrote to the Epoch Times that was a comment on a piece that was written by a friend of ours from the Frontier Center for Public Policy, Brian Giesbrecht, a former judge in Manitoba, entitled "It's Time for Struggling Remote First Nations to Opt for the Smallwood Solution." And you wrote a comment. Of course, you had something to do with the Smallwood Solution. You want to explain what the Smallwood Solution is, and maybe explain your take on why this might be something that is useful to raise First Nations communities out of deprivation and poverty. In which, I mean, if you've ever been to a First Nations community in this country, you know, sadly, that the vast majority of them are living under what we used to call third world conditions, where water cannot even be consumed. And frankly, I can't think of any prime minister, and I'm speaking as an Indigenous person now, I can't think of any prime minister who's done less for Indigenous peoples while bragging more about what all of the great things that he's done. So what was your take on Mr. Giesbrecht's
Well, I never ever
argument?
thought I would have to revisit the resettlement policy of Smallwood. Matter of fact, I've got a couple of books here that I'm about to reference to Mr. Ginsberg, ask him to read.
Yeah.
One of the biggest problems you have in Canada is from afar looking at what academically looks like a solution to a problem that you may know something about in another part of Canada, and transfer that policy to that other part of Canada. And this is what Mr. Ginsberg, unfortunately, does in his article. I was very saddened. I actually wrote him first before I wrote the editors of the Epoch Times, letting him know I was going to be taking issue with his using the resettlement. Mr. Small, the first Premier of Newfoundland, decided in the early 1950s, after he had given away jurisdiction over the fishery to the federal government, first time in the history of Newfoundland, that Newfoundlanders never had the major say over their major industry. But this is all part of his plan that he devised back in the 1930s in a book he wrote, that I have right here on right now. I have that book in which he talked about Newfoundland in order to survive has to industrialize or perish. And he downplayed the fishery. He never said no fishery, but he downplayed the fishery, upplayed industrialize or perish. And scores of industries were attracted to Newfoundland through an economic advisor that he hired from Latvia. From Latvia. In the same way as a very learned and awarded professor, Percival Copes of Simon Fraser, was one of the architects of Smallwood's resettlement policy. And so the whole idea was to take a whole bunch of communities in all the bays around Newfoundland and bring them to bigger centers. Sometimes build an actual new center.
Interesting.
Take them out of all of the islands and inlets in Newfoundland and bring them. Like I said to Trudeau, and I'm going to go back to Mr. Gensbrick again because he's responded to me, still thinking he really had a point. I remember way back as a boy learning very quickly, because I grew up in rural Newfoundland. I grew up in fishing communities. I know about these places. And I was a social worker in them for five summers. My father was a social worker. We grew up with this resettlement process. So Smallwood decided that we had too many communities, or too spread out, and we must bring them into bigger growth centers, close these other places down, and then we'll have all these new industries, plus our forestry and our mining, and that will make us one of the great nations of the world. He said that in his book. Mm-hmm. One of the great small nations of the world would be Newfoundland within 12 years. From 1930. When I was born in 1942, we were supposed to be one of the great small nations of the world, according to Mr. Small. This is the architect, with others, of the resettlement policy. Now, so it was a top-down, one-size-fits-all kind of thing, which we all know never works.
Right.
This is what happened here. As I'm saying to Mr. Gisbrick and the paper in more letters that I will be sending back later today, is that I learned early on as a boy hearing fishermen say, it's just one problem. Everybody thinks they're an expert in the fishery and nobody understands it. The inshore fishery of Newfoundland is a highly complex industry.
It's a unique environment, isn't it?
Multifaceted industry of many different species, not just codfish. Mm-hmm. Not just codfish. And that there are bays in Newfoundland today where the fishery is prosecuted is a lobster fishery. In another part of the same bay, it's a ground fishery. It's a whitefish or a ground fishery or a cod fishery. Or in another part, a crab fishery. All in the same bay. All in the same bay.
Remarkable.
Like I said to Pierre Elliott Trudeau in the First Ministers' Conference when we used to have them, when he talked about all Peckford wants and the provinces want to take over everything, take over the fishery. And I made the comment to him that you and the press, I said, don't understand that the fishery you're talking about, the fish that you're talking about, happened to swim from offshore Newfoundland to inshore Newfoundland. That was that's the natural migration of the codfish.
Right.
That's why we talk about the fishery that way, because it happens to come into our jurisdiction right to the shoals. And why the many communities in Newfoundland is because they were close to what? The fishing grounds where they lay their traps. If you move them 20 miles inland or 30 miles or 100 miles inland to some growth center, you deprive them of the fishery and almost make sure that the draggers, which are going to destroy the ground, right, the fishing grounds, are going to vacuum up all of the fish. This is what's missing. People don't understand that there are fishermen in Newfoundland who are crab fishermen. There are fishermen in Newfoundland who are lobster fishermen, right? There are fishermen in Newfoundland who have multiple licenses, from herring to mackerel to cod to turbot, whatever. It's a complex area. It's like when the Premier Brian Tobin years ago went down to the United Nations or whatever, hanging up that fish, if you remember. He thought he was doing something wonderful. Only problem was it was a turbot, which is a very minor fish.
Yeah.
In Newfoundland, the codfish is the main ground fish, but it gets complex and gets complicated. And so, unfortunately, from a distance, it seems, and I think Mr. Ginsberg has come back to me and accused me of being too close to it or too emotional. About it.
Well, I have to say, Brian, being accused by Trudeau, particularly the two who have been our prime minister, of wanting to control everything, is a statement dripping with irony. And I want to finish off by asking you about our current prime minister, Justin Trudeau. And as you know, there has been there is ongoing backlash, and well justified, as you know, against this really absurdly destructive budget, which is another in a series of disastrous budgets, which, in my respectful view, put on full display that the people running our country do not have a sweet clue how to run a country, especially not in terms of fiscal policy. But do you think that it's possible that the popularity of Trudeau is at a point now where Canadians will begin to finally demand change? Or do you think that things are going to have to get a lot worse before they get better in this country? What are your thoughts there?
Well, first of all, yeah, I'm, I guess, one of the few people who had to publicly debate both Pierre Trudeau Sr. and Trudeau Jr. on major national public policy. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I'm in a bit of a sort of unique position in that sense. And so I remember when we talked about genetics earlier?
Yes.
Well, it comes back full sway here because I remember the wage and price controls. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We demanded a meeting in Ottawa, and there were a number of meetings, but one of the meetings was a meeting between business and premiers and the Prime Minister and his ministers behind closed doors. This is when he got socialist Canadian John Kenneth Galbraith to come up from the United States. He was one of his advisors. I mean, the last person in the world that you'd want to advise you on national economic policy at that time, because, you know, it was very, very socialistic and against what most of the provinces wanted. Anyway, I remember being in a meeting with Mr. Trudeau and his ministers and a number of corporate people from across Canada, including the McCains from New Brunswick, for example, and other corporate leaders, bankers and so on. And how we had to shake our heads afterwards about what was discussed in that meeting. The understanding of the economics of Canada was lost on Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and is lost upon his son. Mm-hmm. It's very, very sad. Mm-hmm. The other thing, though, that we always got to be careful of, one of the things that's happening now is, and so I don't think we're going to get the change we need, because I think it's going to be just another political party. The hatred for Trudeau has become so great now that even like in the last couple of days, I've been involved and talked to people about Bill 36 in BC, which was passed back in 22 now.
Yes, very concerning.
Some people are thinking it passed yesterday, and they bring up Trudeau. It's almost like it's Trudeau's bill when it's Premier Eby's bill. Yeah. My point is that the provinces very often on COVID and so on are getting off scot-free because of the hatred for Trudeau. And everything bad that's happening in the country, whether it's either municipally or provincially, is Trudeau's fault. And so a lot of the leaders, so-called leaders of our country, who are not leaders at all, are getting off scot-free, which is not good either.
Yeah.
Either.
And the premiers, in your view, could be doing a lot more for the people
Oh,
of their respective provinces, right?
I mean, even during the Emergencies Act, I mean, it came down to they had to be pushed to say, no, we really don't need the Emergencies Act. We have enough powers here. But they had to be pushed to say that. Right? They had to be pushed to say that. So the problem is that they had to be pushed to actually act as members of the national community. You know, as we talked about earlier, the Constitution of Canada is one of shared jurisdictions. In other words, a premier also got national responsibilities as well as provincial responsibilities.
Right.
And the federal prime minister has national responsibilities as well as federal responsibilities. This is what's lost on our country, is that these, under the Constitution, the premiers and the prime minister together are forged national. This is why we always talked about First Ministers' conferences and how necessary they are. And I put it as part of my Magna Carta that I issued a couple of years ago, which is fallen on deaf ears, right? Which is fallen on deaf ears, saying these very things, that you need to have First Ministers' conferences because this court with national problems. So, unfortunately, I think Trudeau, obviously, and the Liberal Party is going to be in the wilderness for quite some time come the next election. But what we replace it with doesn't seem to me to be sufficient to reestablish the democracy and the morality that was so much a part of Canada in the past.
Yeah, Canada is a country of great contradictions, and one of the things that's sort of counterintuitive about our country, I think, is that the federation, the confederation, seems to work better when the power within it is decentralized, where you have strong provinces. You do not have a federal government that sort of overruns and behaves like a national government. And I think that that's one of the antidotes to the chaos we're living through right now, is getting stronger leadership. I don't want to paint them all with the same brush. I think there are some premiers who are showing promise. I wouldn't say that there's anyone in the country right now that is in the class of the 8 men that you described. But you know, there's hope that perhaps if we get more of these servant leaders, that could be something that could really change our country for the better. Well, you know, Brian, we've kept you for a long time. And as you know, I wanted to get to the reading list. I understand you've done your homework, and as always, you've got some great books to share with us. I'm going to talk about a couple very briefly, and then I'm going to hand it over to you for the last word. So this book, I'm not sure how you feel about this book, but it's one that I read recently, and I actually published a commentary on my program about. It's the most recent book written by Lord Conrad Black. And it's called Forgotten History, Civil Rights in Canada. One of the things I like about Conrad Black in several of his books is he tells Canadian history, a true Canadian history, a history of our country that we can and should be proud of, not the sort of Canadian history that is proffered and propagandized in Canada. He describes a country that is beautiful and is full of incredible people and has accomplished great things and has greatness in it in our future. Those are the things I really like about Conrad Black's book. His most recent book is describing many recent events in Canadian public life that have highlighted the evolution of the concept of individual rights in our country. And this is something that our guest talks about a lot on his blog, and he's talked about today. And he talks about the history of civil rights, the development of the concept of civil rights in our country in the context of the Freedom Convoy and the uses of the Emergencies Act. And he traces our civil rights back through the Charter and also back through parts of our Constitution, small c Constitution, that a lot of people forget about. Things like the Magna Carta, things like the 1688 English Bill of Rights, things like the Diefenbaker Bill of Rights, all of which are constitutional documents, but that our courts seem to ignore in an all-encompassing, very myopic view of what the Canadian Constitution is in terms of the Constitution Act and the Charter. So this book, I think, is very instructive for people who want to gain a better understanding of what the development of civil rights has been like in Canada, in the English common law tradition, and also some of the challenges that we're facing in this country in terms of protecting civil rights. The second book is a little bit different. It's off the track, but I think is one that that my guest has probably read. It's a book by Roger Scruton, one of his many wonderful books, but it's one that was published actually posthumously. It's called Modern Culture. He died in 2017. This book was published around Christmas of the following year. And he asked the question, a really important question I think we need to address in Canada. What do we mean by culture? This word, purloined by journalists to denote every kind of collective habit, lies at the center of contemporary debates about the past and future of society, and I believe Canadian society. And so in this thought-provoking book, Roger Scruton argues for the religious origin of culture in all its forms and mounts a defense of the high culture of our civilization, that is Western civilization, against its radical and deconstructionist critics. And I think this book was very prescient in that it foresaw a lot of what we're seeing today. Things like what's happening right now at Columbia University. It's being taken over by radicals, one of the bastions of learning in North America and indeed the world. And so in this book, Dr. Scruton offers a theory of pop culture, a panegyric of Baudelaire, a few reasons why Wagner is just as great as his critics fear it to be, and a raspberry to cool Britannia. And so it's a must for all people who are fed up to their tightly clenched front teeth with Derrida, Foucault, Oasis, and Richard Rogers and the whole postmodernist crowd. So those are the two books that I'm suggesting today. And with that, I'll turn it over to our guest, and I'm very excited to listen to his suggestions.
Well, first of all, I want to deal with Conrad Black, and I agree. He's written some wonderful stuff. I have not yet read the one you just referred, his latest, which is a very important book. Very important book. I've done it in my way, in my speeches and so on. I think I might have on your program before, talking about the early reformers in Canada, and
Right.
I've referred specifically to the Government of Canada by Professor Dawson. This book, by the way, was given to me by my father.
Oh, really?
Wow. Yes. Professor Dawson wrote the Government of Canada, and this is a wonderful book. I have it near me all the time, and he helps elucidate a lot of the early constitutional, if you will, governmental actions as it relates to Upper Canada, Lower Canada, Quebec, Ontario, and the other colonies as they became representative government and then responsible government,
Right.
all before Confederation.
Right.
All before Confederation. So people need to know their history
Yes.
of our governmental systems. And this is one that gives it to you in the first 100 pages. You can get a better feel for the people who really were the real leaders for constitutional development in our country. The other one is the Constitution itself, of course, and of course one of the great documents by Hague as it relates to the constitutional law of Canada.
Yes,
I
have read that one. That was required reading in law school. He's a brilliant man.
Brilliant fellow. Anyway, I'm going to get on to a couple of other ones I got to mention before, if you don't mind. I don't know how much time.
No, absolutely.
Thomas More, Portrait of Courage, by Professor Gerard B. Wegemer at the University.
Thomas More is the patron saint of all lawyers.
Thomas More. This is an absolutely wonderful book.
Yeah.
There's a book of courage, how he stood and lost his life to Henry VIII, who was his best friend and who hired him, and his big family, and great lawyer, as you know.
Yes.
This is a book.
Brilliant.
and
Yeah.
talk about courage and
He's a
leadership.
Lord Chancellor of England. There's a great
He was Lord Chancellor
movie,
of England. That's right.
A Man for All Seasons. That
Yes.
people want to know that story. It's a wonderful movie that stars some
Yeah.
great actors. I believe it was made in the 1960s. If people
Yeah.
want to see the movie to learn more about St. Thomas More, it was a very
Yeah.
godly, principled, and brilliant legal mind.
Exactly. Exactly. And here's a book, because I love the books. I always want to go to the books. So I like the movies afterwards. But the book,
Yeah,
book
absolutely.
yeah,
You always get more out of the book for sure.
yeah. And then there's the great 20th century social philosopher Hannah Arendt. And I'm presently
Oh, yes.
reading The Human Condition, one of her books.
Wow.
I've just finished reading Origin of Totalitarianism that she wrote. And here's the other one. This one has little gems, almost on every page, that you never thought about. That her entry into gems of wisdom and concepts are quite startling. Quite startling.
Yes, she
quite an
really
interesting
understood the psychology of
Yes.
totalitarianism,
Yes.
and was able to relate that in a way that is not simple to understand, but is digestible for people who are not
Yeah.
psychologists and experts. And that's a gift to be able to do that,
Yeah.
to take something that is complex and bring it down to the level where we can all of us mere mortals can understand that. And that's something that, frankly, sir, you're very good at. And we're grateful for that today.
Anyway, this is anybody who wants to get into philosophy, this is the book you have to read. And then finally, this one I've been hammering on my blog, and I've just finished doing all the summaries of the chapters, and I'm now putting on my blog the conclusions, is the one on vaccines.
Yes. What a great
Turbulence
book.
all the way down.
Maybe the best book on the vaccines so far. Yeah.
Talk about this book. Nobody wants to talk about this book.
Yeah.
It's
brilliant.
I sent it out widely to learned freedom lovers in the country, especially in the medical field, asking them to read it, and after they read it, let me have their views. One got back to me.
Well, I'm remiss in doing it because you introduced me to that book and I did read it. And so I will be the second one, sir. I promise. I'll get back to you on it. I'm so grateful that you introduced me to this book. It really is a unique and important work on the COVID-19 vaccines. If you're going to read any book, lots of people read, the Robert F. Kennedy book, and that one's good. There's also the Bregan book, the two Dr. Bregans produced a wonderful book.
I got them all.
But here. I would say that one is the best of the bunch. Yes.
No question. You can go to an individual one, and like I said, I got 8 or 10 of them here. But the Bregans and Kennedy's stuff and what's his name, Atlas, who was with and the Great Barrington Declaration and Jeffrey Tucker's books and all of these people. But if you want 1,200 references that are available to you, that are available to you,
copiously documented, just irrefutable.
A wonderful book. People will, and it's down to earth. Anybody can read this book.
Yes,
anybody can read this book.
Yes,
as the summaries on my blog in the last 2 weeks have demonstrated. I had somebody write me this morning. I don't know where they were from because I get quite a few people writing to me about that. And this person just wrote to say, Mr. Peckford, I'm just so overwhelmed and pleased that you introduced me to this book. I would never have perhaps knew it existed if you hadn't put those summaries. And as I went on with the summaries, this person got more and more interested, and then finally had to go get the book.
Amen. I firmly echo that sentiment. And we are going to provide a link to your blog. Folks, this is one of the best blogs you will find anywhere. You get an insight into politics, history, religion, culture, current events, economics. It's all there on Brian's blog. I follow it closely. And I'm so grateful that I'm on his emailing list. I get these pop up and I always take the time to read them. I always learn something new from this man. As I said, he's a national treasure. And Brian, we're so grateful that you took this time with us, and also grateful for the incredible work that you are doing as a thought leader in our country. And you were describing earlier, the servant leadership. Even though you're not in a political role today, I would say that you still see yourself in that mold. And so many people admire you for the work that you're doing. It really is courageous. As many people wouldn't bother at your stage of life with all that you've accomplished. You've climbed the mountain, and I'm sure that you'd rather not be doing this. You'd rather be relaxing and enjoying your retirement and maybe writing a third book. But you are doing all this incredible work to bring to the Canadian populace insight, knowledge, wisdom about what's happening in our country, where we're so beset by censorship and disinformation and misinformation and all of the words. So we're so grateful for all the work that you're doing, and especially for being our special guest today here in Grey Matter. God bless you.
God bless you, and thank you very much for having me.
All right, thanks.